I remember when we first met. It was in the mid-'90s in Chicago.
That's right. You were undergrad.
Yeah, I was an undergrad. And you just come from the Smithsonian.
National Endowment for the Arts.
The NEA, sorry.
NEA.
See, this is like,
Well,
you can edit these things.
Yes.
But you were the visiting artist director.
Exactly.
At the Arts of Chicago. So I feel like what I recall was in the mid-'90s, I worked at this wine bar that you would come to with your friends.
Oh, my
And I remember
goodness.
back then that you were already talking about performance. You had been interested in dance at the time, and I'm sure you still are, which I don't remember that particular conversation. But I remember we had been talking early on, since the mid-'90s, about performance, very casually. I was a waiter, so it wasn't like we were hanging out at the bar, but that's sort of like how I remember you. And your presence at the Arts of Chicago was really quite... you came around the same time as Kim Pinder came in.
Exactly.
And there were a lot of issues at the time about diversity at the school.
Especially among faculty and staff and students.
Absolutely,
yes.
absolutely. So I remember your presence. Your presence there was, in fact, radical, because you really changed the color, the tone of the visiting artist program. That's how I remember.
That's interesting, because I totally forgot about the wine bar.
Yeah.
Which I'm a big fan of, by the way. But I do remember you as Barbara DeGenevieve's student.
Right.
I remember your work. I remember the work with the body. And for some reason, I specifically remember it was like a couch or a futon, and how you would position your body in relation to that object. You're right. I think performance was in my mind's eye at the time. I had just come off of the curating that Whitney. No, I think it was even before the Whitney. It was before the Whitney.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure why dance or performance in particular was within my scope. I think it had a lot to do with where the university wanted to go, and the Gutman Theater at the time, I don't know if you remember,
I do.
was at the end of the block, right
right.
down the street from where my offices were. And I think there was an initiative to somehow find a way to integrate performance that was already a department into something a little larger, a little more well, it could not have been any more experimental.
Yeah,
but certainly somehow to integrate those two. And I think for some reason my mind was thinking through that, and of course thinking through people of color, because at the time, you're right, there was hardly any staff, any faculty of color, and I think when Kim came, that leveled the number to 7 out of the entire School of the Art Institute faculty, both full-time. So it was a very interesting time, and to know that you were there. Sanford was there.
That's right.
Lauren Kelly was there.
That's right.
In fact, Lauren was one of my assistants. Rodney McMillan was there. Yeah. And I remember knowing all of you because it was one of those things like, yes, there is someone who looks like me in this place.
That's right.
And it was a wonderful thing.
I thought it was a really heady time at the school. And that was right after Dred Scott had that very controversial piece.
The proper way to display American flag.
And now he's in this exhibition.
He is.
And still making highly politicized work.
Very provocative and politicized work.
So a lot of interesting things came out of the Arts of Chicago while you were there. And it's really amazing to think about when I worked on Anthology with Chris Liu. We had actually been friends for 5 years. And before that even happened, before he became an assistant curator. So it's really interesting to think about the longevity in terms of an artist and curator, and the conversations that lead up to, working together.
No, it's true.
I love that very much.
And it was the same way with us.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, it was. Gosh, I had known you since the mid-'90s.
Right.
And we had the exhibition in, 2011?
Yeah, that's right.
January of 2011. So it is about that level of trust, and it's more of a collaborative I see exhibitions and my work with artists as very much collaborative.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you do build a relationship.
Yeah.
And you do build trust over time.
That's right.
And the kind of conversations that we would have, I thought, even though they weren't always like, we didn't talk every day,
right.
But when we did talk, there were these long conversations about, what's happening in your life, what's happening with your work, what's the state of the art world. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes I would call you and say, Cliff, I'm stumped. Yeah. Who's doing X, Y, and Z? What do you find is interesting right now? Mm-hmm. And so I always valued that kind of conversation, which, it's interesting coming full circle about the book. Yeah, that's right. And the book I always, allude to as the seed in many ways of what Radical became. Mm-hmm. Because we were very interested. I think it was the time that I was working on Ben Patterson. That's right. Yeah. And you had you restaged Lick yet, or? I did at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 2006. In 2006. Yes, that's right. So you knew I was working on Ben's retrospective, and we started talking about the sort of legacies of Black artists working specifically with performance. That's right. Black visual artists working in performance, and between yourself and the younger generation of artists, what was the trajectory? What lay in between those two, generations? Yeah, sure. And so that certainly got me to thinking, and you to thinking. And it's like, this is a history, a repository that's kind of in plain sight. That's right. And we need to do something about it. And at the time, I didn't even think it could take form as an exhibition. Mm-hmm. And so that's where the book idea came from. That's right. That's right. It started as a book. It started as a book. And I feel like some of the writers we talked about are in the catalog. They are. I know Franklin is one person that we talked about for the book project. Yes. And then, and in fact, I love like the connections, because I know you were talking with Jeff Hendricks, and then his partner, Sir Rodney Sir, is now in the show. And you discovered that I studied with Jeff in Rutgers. Exactly. He was one of my mentors there. Well, wait a minute. I wrote a letter of recommendation for you to go to Rutgers. That's right. That's right. But I forgot that Jeff was there at Rutgers. Right. And he really becomes quite the catalyst in all of this. Absolutely. Because Jeff is the one who was teaching that history, keeping that history of performance alive, particularly with his generation in Fluxus and the people who were involved in Fluxus. And by the by, it was Jeff's brother, John Hendricks, is the person who introduced me to Ben Patterson. So it is a very kind of small spiral, that this information sort of, inhabits this sort of constellation. Sure, and sort of development of things just sort of went along this very interesting spiral. I mean, I love it. I mean, because, Pope Bell studied with Jeff in the 80s at Rutgers. Oh, gosh. Yeah. So, I mean, I really did come out of, sort of pedagogically out of a tradition of performance art. Mm-hmm. It had never been planned. I was always more interested in photography, but the performance stuff just happened naturally, I guess. It made sense to move from photography to live art in terms of the kind of work I was making at the time. Mm-hmm. But so then we were talking about the book, and then years later I get the invitation to do the show at the Studio Museum, or at the PS1, PS1. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of crossover in this exhibition and with anthology. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we talked a lot about anthology before I was making it. Right. You were always sort of consulting me about people to include or how to structure it, and Chris did just a terrific job. Mm-hmm. And so I love seeing a lot of the artists in both our projects. It's so exciting. We thought we would do a book, but we've actually done 2 exhibitions, museum exhibitions, and 2 catalogs. No, and I think that's incredible. So kind of starting to build that repository out. But I think even from the book, really thinking about generationally. Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of the seed comes from too. It's to say, I know I was more well versed about the more historical figures, people like Ben and Senga and Ulysses and Marin and David and Adrian, and I knew up until the 90s. It was more of the younger generation that I wasn't so familiar with. But then to tap into that and to see that as living history.
That's right.
And I think that's the really important part of it is I think the book, and I'm glad that it didn't materialize as the way we envisioned it, because the book would have encapsulated this as something past in an interesting way.
Sure.
And I think both of the projects that you did as anthology and what manifested as Radical shows that this is a living history.
That's right.
That these individuals, that these practices are alive and well, and these spaces are activated in these very interesting ways. And for you as a photographer to capture that, to have the scores written by those artists for you to perform, I mean, it's an incredible sense of generosity.
Yeah, thanks.
That as an artist, that you would then promote and bring visibility to other artists who may, for whatever reasons, recede from, the discussions. So, thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, I think, a lot of artists, we always compliment you on being very much an impulse of what artists of color are doing. Mm-hmm. You really have been a really amazing advocate for a lot of artists who I think would otherwise get lost in history. Ben Patterson in particular, that was such an important exhibition, absolutely important exhibition. And of course he's quite well known in Europe, but it's always so peculiar and strange to me that he got lost in history of Fluxus. So anthology really came out of sitting in Kathy Odell's class and her putting up a slide of Ben Patterson preparing the double bass. And before that, prior to that slide, that's how old I am. I use slides by hand.
It's only a recent development.
It's like digital files. It's like all these, white artists, and then suddenly there's this image of this black man. And I'm like, what the fuck is this about? Who knew? Who knew? Right. So it feels like both our projects really come from Ben Patterson's presence.
Absolutely.
In fact, it was, I guess, although I don't think he was politicized, he doesn't usually talk about racial politics, but I think I've always thought of him as a kind of radical artist, to inhabit those social and political and economic spaces as an artist, and to do that work that nobody was doing. I mean, I've been saying for 10 years how unpopular performance art is, especially in the black community. But for him back then, it's like he was a freak.
Well,
not a freak, but
he was an anomaly.
He was an anomaly.
And you're right. I think the body is material. Just in its very nature. Yeah. He's politicized, whether he would speak that or not. I think very early on he never saw that as a part of his personhood. Yeah. He felt that interrogating elitism, sort of turning a double bass upon its head. I mean, I think he comes from a whole vantage point where here was an individual who went to the University of Michigan, very, high achieving scholastically, academically, in terms of performance and composition, and then coming out of school in the 1950s and not being able to get a job in a symphony and orchestra across the U.S. because they were segregated. You're already coming into a politicized situation. The fact that he had to go to Canada to even perform, and then was drafted.
It's amazing.
What? It's already a politicized situation, and it just brings full circle the fact that the black body always carries with it some charge, some political charge. Whether one needs to acknowledge it, speak it, defer to it, artistically is a whole different story. But it's sort of a built-in mechanism, I guess, that serves as a catalyst for many different things. And I think it's when he gets really to the point of coming back to the U.S. in the mid-1960s that he does become politicized. It's when he moves away from Fluxus, or the artists associated with Fluxus, because of their refusal to be politicized.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's a very interesting thing. But I think, just going back a little, my seed of interest for Ben was exactly as you say. you know, looking, it was when I was working with John and the Yoko Ono exhibition when it came to Houston, and looking through documentation that was being put into cases and saying, my God, who is the black man in the photograph? I mean, I know that is a black man. Who is that black man? And going from that point on is a moment of discovery. And I think George Lewis did a wonderful thing in the Patterson catalog, which was to talk about his journey of finding Ben Patterson, someone who studied classical music and all but fades into the recesses and is on the verge of obscurity and is sort of brought back into the consciousness. So, you know, I feel incredibly fortunate to have found the interest and the wherewithal in the museum to provide the resources to really, and it was supposed to be an exhibition that had a 2-year lead time, and it turned into a 5-year lead time, which enabled me to really get to know Ben in a way that I would have never known. And so that's,
That's
he's
amazing.
an amazing human being.
Yeah, he's really great. I mean, in terms of like the body, I remember we had conversations when you were putting together Radical about gender even.
Yes.
And then we had a conversation about, well, what constitutes blackness. And we had this great conversation about including, Latin artists.
Yeah.
And
Caribbean artists from the Caribbean.
Absolutely. And that was very important for you in putting the exhibition together.
Yes.
So including Sean Leonardo,
Right.
people from SCO,
Right.
and others, and multiracial individuals like Satchel. And it's really interesting to think about your consideration about difference or blackness and thinking of it in a much more expansive way.
Right. I mean, and
gender.
It's a very finite exhibition,
Yeah.
and I state very clearly it is a survey, and it tries to be comprehensive, but by no stretch of the imagination could it ever be comprehensive at this juncture. But it was important to focus on something beyond just, artists from the United States, black artists from the United States. I think the discourse becomes so much richer, when you especially include the diaspora, when you include the Caribbean, places like the Dominican Republic, which has had its own issues, and those were interesting things to talk about, and to have Sean Leonardo's work, the El Conquistador versus the Invisible Man. I mean, it just sort of completely encapsulates the conversation. Jacques Fabry, Coco, of course, who, hats off to that woman, is amazing. And so Papacolo,
that's right, Papacolo,
whose Superman 51 was all about protesting the refusal of the U.S. to include Puerto Rico as a state for statehood. So, I mean, those are definitely conversations that only serve to make the exhibition that much richer.
That's right. Yeah. So you are very sensitive to and respectful of history, too.
Oh, absolutely.
So that the exhibition is scholarly, but you're also a great curator. So bringing both together is quite...
Well, I'll accept that. I would never say it, but I'll accept it.
Well, you know what I mean? It's like everything is very, very thought out, very considered, very considerate of the context and the content of the exhibition.
I thought it was important. I thought it was important if you're really seeking to look at the trajectory of black artists working in performance. I'm always keenly aware that artists are not hermetically sealed.
That's right.
That they are part and parcel of the world around them, and that the conversations that they have with their work, through their work, is sometimes in direct response to the world around them. And so to go from subsequent generations, I also wanted to provide a snapshot of what was happening in the world in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, and what people were preoccupied with. In some cases, like Jacoby, it is all about, what constitutes the body, and what can we transcend, this assigned, these sort of biological assignments. And so that's a very different conversation than what was happening with Danny Tisdale's Transitions Inc.
You know what? What's interesting, I mean, you've done a great job of being as inclusive as possible, but you can't put everybody in the exhibition.
Right, of course.
And so are there questions about who's excluded that you really find nagging and annoying? Because I can imagine that the Black dance art world feels perhaps excluded from this exhibition or this conversation about Black performance art, but it seems we've always made the distinction between the performing arts and performance art.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
But there's always going to be that sort of pushback.
And
I'm so tired of hearing the conversation with anthology and radical presence, but, well, you didn't put this person in. Well, why didn't you ask this person for a score? And I'm like, well, first of all, I did, and they didn't give me a score.
Right.
Secondly, I can't, this is something that I think we talked about the book. It's like we wanted to open up scholarship about U.S. Black performance art.
Right.
And so this is the beginning. This is the germ of something that's going to, you know,
hopefully continue to grow.
Yeah.
And yes, I mean, are there nagging questions? No. I mean, clearly, again, within a finite resources with finite space, it is absolutely impossible to tap each and every person. And the idea was to look at visual artists who engaged in performance practices.
Right.
And that was, to me, there had been scholarship already on Black artists working from theater, Black artists, not necessarily from dance, but definitely theater. And this would help to narrow and create a niche, you know, that I thought was more specific to the world that I find myself aligned to, which is the museum world, the visual arts world. So that's what I, and then there are people like Senga and Maren who come out of dance, but whose focus then is then narrowed into the visual, you know. There's Ben who comes out of music, but then whose focus goes into the visual, integrating both music and the visual capacity. Right. So, you know, I had to make some hard and fast decisions about what constituted that. Yes, there are tons of artists that could have been in the show. Tons of artists that could have been. And in fact, Sir Rodney Sir, as part of his free advice, totally revised the chronology, which I thought was pretty hysterical and wonderful. It's kind of radical. And, you know, he put in people like Jack Waters, who I tremendously respect, you know, who could have been in this show. I mean, he went from dance into filmmaking, but filmmaking not necessarily from his own vantage point. Marsha, whose name totally escapes me, which was a transgender performance artist, who I did not even know about. So, you know, that revised chronology opens up the discourse even further. And I don't see this exhibition as being something that doesn't get pushed against.
That's right. That's right.
And if people, and I was telling Naima Keith this last night, I was like, if people can come out of graduate school in art history doing yet another dissertation on Picasso's Blue Period, which turns into yet another book, why does there only have to be one book of Black performance?
That's right.
It's unheard of.
That's right.
You know, so I mean, I welcome it.
Yeah.
I want there to be pushback. I want it to be the seed of conversation that continues to grow. I don't see it in any way as the end all and be all to anything. And in fact, I want to give a shout out to John Boyles at the University of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, for doing an amazing project chronicling this as a website, which is ever evolving and ongoing. So shout out to John, and that somehow continues to keep this dialogue alive. But I hope that there are many more books. I mean, if it starts with these two in 2011 and 2013, you know, I hope that by 2020 there are at least 7 or 8 more books.
I'm like very hopeful. I'm just so I mean that's like one good thing to maybe end with is, you know, like, do you have a sense of, and this is such an unfair question to ask and impossible to answer.
Well, don't ask it.
I mean, you know, like, do you have a sense of perhaps where you would like performance art to go? Like, how are you feeling about young African American artists in terms of performance art? Not identifying any particular artist, but do you think that this exhibition and anthology have opened things up, or you know, like, what's gonna happen next? You know, like, I don't really think so much about this, but I'm just curious, like, as a curator, if you see trends or any interest in...
There are always trends. I see that there has been an amazing swing back to performance. That somehow among this younger generation, they have embraced performance as a practice. I don't think, and I think it is something that is very particular of younger generations, and I'm dating myself because I'm saying these young people, they could be my children, you know, that there is a multifacetedness about what they do, and they are never in one place very long.
Yeah.
Like, they explore all elements, all aspects of what there is to be explored, and dabble in all of these things, and then move on. So, I mean, I think this embrace of performance, it may be a short-lived burst. It could have some real sustainability. You know, I wonder if the people who are engaged in it now will still be engaged in it 5 years from now. Right.
And then I look at artists like Sidney Goody and Marion Hassinger and others who didn't make a fucking dime.
Yeah.
And it's not that we are all entitled to make a bunch of money, but, you know, 30-year careers,
should be able to sustain a living.
40-year careers.
Yeah.
And, you know, it just really pisses me off sometimes. And I know that race is a part of how certain artists don't get
absolutely
support or access.
But listen, you're looking at performance as a practice to be on the edge of the edge.
Yeah.
Okay? And then you're looking at black artists who are working in this realm as being even further recessed into all of this. So when you have someone like, you know, the artist is present, bringing really shining a spotlight onto performance art, you know, that then becomes the catalyst for people to then look and seek more of who's working in this practice.
I mean, Marina Abramovic is a great artist.
She's a great artist.
Enormous respect for her. It's a different example.
But no, it's almost the same example, right? Because that's saying, here's someone who has now been elevated, who has elevated a practice, which has really been on the margins for a very, very long time. And so it takes a while for things in its wake. And that's not to say that people will ever, you know, enable someone like Samuel or Marin to be commercially successful as artists, because there's simply this thing of this body that in many ways, I would say David is probably the most, is probably the example of someone in this body that has achieved that. And he stayed true to his practice in a very interesting way. Can other people replicate that? I don't know. I mean, even as a curator, our museum is not even, it's a non-collecting institution.
Yeah, sure.
So being totally outside of that kind of like exchange, it's something that I don't really think about a lot. I just try to focus on providing a context. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think there may be something that happens in the wake of all of this. You know.
I mean, I just want some real conversation. You know.
I think that's happening.
Instead of just like the spectacle of it all. I just think it's really unfortunate, and there hasn't been any real serious critique. And maybe that'll take a while.
I think it'll take a while, because it's got to get to the surface first. It's got to get to the consciousness first. And there still is space for critique to happen.
Absolutely.
But I think until it rises to the surface, until people have it in their consciousness, it's hard to have a conversation when half the people don't know what you're talking about. You know, and it's hard to be critical of something when the fullness of it hasn't really come into view. So I think it's going to take a moment. I would be interested to see what does happen once sort of radical dies down, and once anthology dies down. Will it go back to the sort of quiet, desolate land of, you know, performances happening, no one's paying attention? I think Bill says in his foreword something about performance art, like, you know, how many performances does it take to do whatever, and he goes, I don't know, I left halfway through the performance. And so does it go back to that?
Yeah.
You know, where it's this tedious medium that people really have less of a tolerance for, or does it open the door for people to embrace it and be present for it? You know, I think time it's just going to take a little time to see.
Yeah. Well, we have another year of Radical. Right?
Another year. It goes to the Walker after this, after it's New York, and you know, this has been an amazing journey, and so thank you for being a part of the whole beginning, the genesis.
Absolutely.